Hello guys, how are you?
I'm Hardeep Singh. Welcome back to your own YouTube channel. IELTS updates and recent exams. For more updates related to recent IELTS exam writing test topics, listening, reading, practice test, and speaking, you can guesswork. Please guys participate in everyday listening and reading practice test to achieve your desired band score in your actual IELTS exam. Please hit the like and subscribe button. Press the bell icon for the upcoming notifications. Don't forget like, subscribe and share my YouTube channel and my Facebook page, IELTS updates and recent exams.
Part 1. Look at questions 1 to 4.
Good evening, everyone. This evening, I'm going to continue last week's lecture by talking more about how people spend their money. First of all, I'm going to compare how people of different age groups spend their cash. You probably know that there's a lot of difference between what young people do with their money, how families spend their money, and what more mature people do. Secondly, I want us to think about what we imagine men and women spend their money on. And then, I'm going to look at male and female spending patterns and see whether we were right. Okay, to start with, let's divide the population into 3 sections. Let's say young people up to the age of 30 in the first group. Then, let's put families in the 30 to 55-year-old group. So that puts adults over 55 in the mature group. Does that make sense?
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 5 to 10.
Right, well, I found that the first group, that's young people up to the age of 30, mostly spend their money on clothes, music and entertainment. That's not really very surprising, is it? Although I must admit, I thought they might spend a lot on cars and travelling around. So, the next group is what I've called families, people in the age group from 30 to 55. Naturally, as I expected, this group spends most of its money on food, toys and trips out. But I was surprised to find that people aged between 30 and 55 spend most of their money on furniture and kitchen equipment. I suppose it's logical if you think about it. People are usually improving their homes at that age, and household equipment is very expensive. But they also spend a lot of money on electronic equipment, like video games for the children. Now turning to the third group, that's people over 55. I thought they'd spend their money on gardening tools and electronic equipment, but I was wrong again. People in the over 55s group spend most money on new cars and days out. So, what did we think about how men and women spend their money? Okay. Well, we thought that young women would spend a lot on clothes and shoes, and that young men would buy more electronic equipment and cars. Well, when we look at the figures, we can see that we were right about the men. Young men spend twice as much as women on cars and computers. But, and this is interesting, we were wrong about the women. I was surprised to find that young women spend much more on beauty treatments than they do on clothes and shoes. So we'll have to think about that again. And there's another interesting fact about young women. It looks as though young women are much more concerned about their diet than men. We found that although young women don't spend as much as men on eating out, they do spend a lot more on organic foods than young men.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 2.
You will hear a talk about young people living on their own. Listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 12.
Loneliness is something we all suffer from in varying degrees, but young people living on their own can be particularly vulnerable. Many who leave the family home find they are less confident and have more difficulty in finding their feet than they expected. Often, going to work or study in another town or city will be the first time they have lived away from home. Although this may sound like an adventure for those dying to get away from the glare of the parental eye, for others it is a daunting prospect which generates apprehension, uncertainty and even fear. In fact, in a recent survey of over 1,600 people who had recently left home, 32% said that understanding and coping with loneliness was a crucial issue for them and made them feel highly stressed and distracted. An annual report by researchers last year recorded a noticeable increase in the number of individuals with homesickness, transition and isolation issues. Acknowledging that feelings of loneliness and isolation could impede progress at work or study, they examined the number of people using the welfare and health services. They found that young people in particular were prone to difficulties. Last year, 61% of all people using counselling services were aged under 30, and of this group, 57% were men.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at question
13 to 20.
Leaving home involves a major change in lifestyle, work patterns and degree of independence. You will be away from home, family and friends and are no longer supported by familiar surroundings. For this reason, in the first year a lot of young people suffer from loneliness. Ironically, this sense of isolation comes at a time when you are likely to be surrounded by people most of the time. Living in a busy city, travelling on crowded buses and trains, you will be constantly among people. But this can sometimes compound your sense of being alone. Seeing others who appear at ease among large crowds, mingling and making friends, can make you feel excluded and inadequate. Adapting to a new environment makes people uncertain of what to do or how to behave and breeds insecurities which can make for a real sense of isolation. It is often those who are more used to being on their own who deal best with the transitional period of leaving home. Other reasons for feeling alone include high expectations of the big city where you have the best time of your life and meet lifelong friends. It may be the first time you have had to make new friends since you started primary school, and perhaps you are reluctant or finding it hard to replace old friends whom you miss. There are also pressures to juggle work and socialising, which may leave you feeling left out. Or it could be that you have a long-distance relationship and feel torn between your new lifestyle and that special person who lives so far away. Because loneliness can leave you with a sense of low self-esteem, where you become self-conscious and feel you have been rejected, it is very difficult to overcome. You may be reluctant to even try and make new friends or take part in social activities, and will also find it difficult to say no to things, leaving you feeling exploited and weak. One of the ways of combating loneliness is to remember that it's not your fault, and that it's something everyone has to deal with, despite appearances. Counsellors advise those feeling lonely to speak to someone they know about their feelings. They also ask them to consider joining groups and societies, and to get involved in activities which interest them as a way of meeting more people. Of course, overdoing it and jamming your schedule with too many things just to avoid being alone will not work. But meeting others with common interests may be a step forward. If you still feel like you need someone to talk to, you could try group counselling, where you will be able to talk to and receive support from a small number of people with the same difficulties as you. For more information or to be put in touch with an individual counsellor, contact the local town hall support services.
That is the end of part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 3.
You hear two students, Charlotte and Damien, telling their tutor about an architecture project they are doing for university. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26.
Well, Charlotte and Damien, what have you decided to do for your architectural project?
We are going to do a study of the first project that famous architect Wilson Prescott designed.
Wilson Prescott, who designed the Charleston Towers in New York and the University Library building here in Benchley, what was his first project? When he first graduated from the University of Manchester in 1972, he worked for a small firm of architects in Buckinghamshire, and in 1973 was given the project of designing a private house for a local family called the Bartletts. So it's called Bartlett House. The house is still standing and is currently for sale for the first time since it was built.
Charlotte and I went to inspect it, and it's still in great shape with its original flooring, bathrooms, and kitchen. We wanted to get a photographic record of it for the university. That was the main reason we went there originally. We heard it was on the market, and we are quite sure that whoever the new owners are, they will completely refurbish it.
Isn't there a preservation order on it? There should be, of course, but no, there isn't. The real estate agent looked a bit concerned when we told him why we were there. A preservation order would make the property much more difficult to sell. People don't like buying houses that restrict them from making alterations. Just the historical value of the photographs is probably enough to base your paper on. What else did you have in mind?
We were quite amazed when we saw the house. The exterior is so much like the work he designed later in his career. He used the same long strip windows in Charleston Towers. In every part of the house, there are reminders of later work that he has done. Look at this photo. Do the columns holding up the extended roof here remind you of anything?
They are the same shape as the ones used in this building in Barcelona. And look, it's the same slate used to cover the bricks that he used on the walls of the university library 30 years later. This is very interesting. He must have only been in his early 20s at the time.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 27 to 30.
And Charlotte has tracked down the original floor plans. She went to the local council chambers and went through the archives to find the original submission.
Good detective work, Charlotte. Of course, they are the original plans. There would have been modifications during the build. So what we have decided to do is make this project into a video presentation, so we can visually compare the original house and plans with his later work. Can we do that on this course? Or can it only be a written project? As long as you have an acceptable amount of text and dialogue, certainly. If you submitted it in paper form, it would need to be highly illustrated anyway, so a video project is a good idea. Are you able to do it at a high technical standard? It would need to be quite sophisticated.
I have quite a lot of experience in editing digital moving images, and you don't really need much equipment to put it together. I have access to the software we need. So in a few hours, I could edit a 10-minute film with voiceover, text, and moving and still images.
It sounds like you are on top of this, but I'd like to see a preliminary version before you submit the project, just so I can be sure that you are on the right track, say 2 weeks before the due date? I think we should be able to do that. Before that, I could give you a complete list of the contents to read as well. We don't want to do all this work and then be told it's not good enough. Have you thought about doing an interview with Wilson Prescott? He is semi-retired these days, but I know he still gives interviews.
We were considering that, but we have no idea how to get in contact with him. If we just call his firm as a couple of university students, the message might not even get passed on to him.
Let me speak to the Dean of Architecture. I know he knows him quite well. He might be able to get in contact with him for you. Let me just take a note of that. I'll let you know how I get on at next week's tutorial.
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
You will hear a part of a lecture about the history of printing. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 34.
The history of printing is usually said to have begun in Europe in the 15th century. But there was a lot of printing going on well before then, mainly in Asia. Almost 600 years before that, Chinese monks were using a process called woodblock printing, where carved wooden blocks are coated with ink and pressed into paper. The earliest book that still exists from this time is the Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 AD, which was discovered in 1900 and is now in the British Library in London. This technique of printing also spread to Korea and Japan, where both wooden and metal blocks were used to produce Buddhist and Taoist scripts. In about 1040, a Chinese peasant called Bi Sheng came up with the idea of movable type. Little is known of Sheng himself, due to his humble origins, but his method of printing, which involved the creation of hundreds of small individual pieces of type made of baked clay, was recorded by a scholar and scientist called Shen Kuo, who lived at the same time. This method survived by occasionally being used in some parts of China during the 12th and 13th centuries because of Shen Kuo's writings, but it wasn't in mainstream use in China or in other countries until centuries later. In any case, though there are written mentions of this technique being used, no early examples of the printed result, or even the ceramic printing characters, have survived. 200 years later, an official in the Chinese court, Wang Zhen, came up with the same idea, but this time the pieces were made of wood. Sometime later, Koreans started casting metal characters. However, block printing remained the dominant form, probably due to the nature of the East Asian languages, which do not have phonetic letters, but require a different pictogram character for every single word. So instead of less than 30 characters, as in European languages, thousands of pieces were required for Chinese. It was not until the idea hit Europe in the 15th century that printing with movable type really took off.
Before you hear the rest of the lecture, you have some time to look at questions 35 to 40.
In Europe, books were still either being handwritten or using some form of the woodblock technique, both of which were very labor-intensive. This resulted in books being highly expensive and only available to the elite. Johannes Gutenberg was a German goldsmith and craftsman who began experimenting with improvements in printing in the middle of the 15th century, and is credited with the invention of movable type. The fact that Gutenberg was able to create such an impressive new technology completely independently does have some scholars scratching their heads. Gutenberg left no written record of how he came up with his ideas. At the time, there were active trade routes along the Silk Road to Europe, and it is not outside the realms of possibility that some or all of the idea of movable type could have been passed on to him from the East. Whatever the case, he was certainly the first in Europe to cast the individual upper and lowercase letters required to print, and he also invented a new ink using linseed oil, which was a major improvement on the water-based inks used in the past. However, it was the wooden printing press itself which was the major breakthrough, and truly original. He used components and systems found in winemaking and paper-making presses to create a mechanized process to put ink onto paper. This meant books could be mass-produced. Mass production not only sped up the process of printing, but reduced its costs enormously. Texts were no longer restricted to religious tracts and the publishing of government materials. Scientific discoveries, philosophy, history, and all forms of literature, including works of satire and sedition, exploded around Europe to an extent never witnessed before. The invention of the printing press changed the whole social and economic landscape in Europe. It was one of the major influences on the Renaissance and the Reformation, fueled social and political change in many countries, and published advances in science which led to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The closest comparison we could use to illustrate its effects would be the influence of the Internet today.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
So guys, don't forget like, subscribe and share my YouTube channel and my Facebook page, IELTS updates and recent exams. For more updates related to recent IELTS exam writing test topics, listening, reading, practice test and speaking, you got guesswork. Please guys, participate in everyday new IELTS listening and reading practice tests to achieve your desired band score in your actual IELTS exam. For more IELTS material, visit my official website www.ieltsupdatesandrecentexams.com. The link is given below in the description. If you need PDF files of latest IELTS material, then please join my Telegram channel. So guys, please write your score below the comment section. Again, thanks for listening. God bless you all guys. Stay tuned, stay safe.